Hello and welcome to another episode of Spar Talk. Today I'm back with Vincent to resume our series on the current world situation. Welcome back, Comrade.
Hello.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about how the world economy works, specifically how the US-dominated system of the last 30 plus years. This, as everybody knows, is a turbulent period, and every day we see many analyses of the economy produced from all sort of, wings of the political spectrum. Oftentimes, when they come from the mainstream media or bourgeois circles, they tend to be mere reflections of the daily moves of the markets. And when they come from the left, often they end up missing the politics. And what we have then is a set of abstractions about how it's necessary to overthrow capitalism. Now, while that's fine and well, what it really doesn't help us to do is what should we do today? So in this episode, what we want to achieve is the following. We want to flesh out a Marxist understanding of how the world works, specifically how it's worked since the end of World War II, in order to figure out why is such an understanding crucial to allow revolutionaries to intervene into this period in a manner that can advance the struggle for socialism. So with that as a goal, I'm going to turn to you and ask you why. Why do we need to go back all the way to the post-war period to be able to understand what the dynamics we're confronted with today are?
Well, the reason in our plenum memorandum, which is what we're discussing in this series, the reason we sort of dived into how the US system works is because it's really to make sense of what Trump is doing. It's important to understand the various mechanisms used by US imperialism and all its inner workings to make sense of exactly what he's doing. And also, most on the left understand somehow that US imperialism is the dominant world power, but don't really understand often how exactly does it do this? How exactly does it function? So I think without getting too technical, and it's easy to get lost in economics into incomprehensible thing, I think the goal is to provide a bit of a general Marxist understanding of the basic functionings of U.S. imperialism in order to understand what is it doing now, and also what we think might happen in the near future, particularly with coming economic crisis, which we'll get to. But then on to your question more precisely, why is it important to go back to World War II? Well, because as we've discussed in previous episode, we live under the American Empire. And the American Empire is really born out of the victory of the US in World War II and having achieved through the greatest carnage in human history, a towering position over all its rivals. And the US emerged from the war really as the industrial powerhouse of the globe. People forget often nowadays, but back then in the 40s and 50s, most of the best industrial production all came from the United States. And it's the industrial might of the United States which also gave it the most powerful military right after World War II. The biggest navy, they were the only ones with nuclear weapons, etc., etc. And so from this towering position, the US was able to create a new sort of world order shaped around its own interests. That's when you have all the institutions born. That's when also you have the dollar, which is established as the world reserve currency. That is the currency used for most international trade and kept in reserves. And back then, the dollar was tied to gold, which provided stability to it. And broadly speaking, this is what created basically the American Empire. And the US was so powerful that it was able to unify the old colonial powers and old imperialist powers. So Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Italy, it was able to unify all these power under its own domination in a sort of like united front of all imperialist powers under the aegis of the US to confront the USSR. And that's quite significant because for the first time ever, like the capitalist world was now unified around the power and the currency of a single, great power, the United States. So that's sort of the foundation of the American Empire. So basically at that time, following World War II, you have a world which basically functions around the United States producing manufacturing goods, exporting them to other countries, and then the United States lending money to those other countries to buy US goods. That was how it basically functioned. However, in the 60s, this relationship starts to change. Europe and Japan rebuilt their industries with great help from the US, the Marshall Plan, for example, and they started to produce goods that were quite competitive. And the US industries started to lag behind in many domains. And furthermore, the US kept pursuing wars abroad. Think of the Korean War, the Vietnam War. All these years, the US was more or less in constant wars to fight Soviet allies, essentially, and forces. And all these elements were becoming a huge strain on the US budget. And before long, it became very clear that the only thing that the US could do to finance the growth of importations, they were buying more produce abroad that they were producing in the US, and also to finance wars, the US was starting to print a lot of money, much more money than its gold reserves could back. And traditionally, that's when empires go bankrupt. That's usually in the history of all empires, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, whatever empire, the Roman Empire, is when they're not able to sustain the weight of their empire, they start getting in the red. That's when, it's really the period of decline. And so the US starts to decline. However, because of its unique position, it was able to turn that situation really to its own advantage. So I'm going through a bit of that history because it's important to understand the evolution of the American empire to arrive to today. And what was very significant and what was sort of new in the US system, which previous empires hadn't been able to do, is that the US creates a system where it gets more and more powerful through debt, essentially. So how does that work? Since the US was now importing more goods than it exported, a lot of foreign countries accumulated a lot of dollars. They would manufacture produce, send them to the US, and the US in exchange gives them dollars. So they have these huge reserves. And that was kind of a good system because they were assuming that these dollars were convertible into gold, so into a real metal value. But obviously, the US was printing more and more and more dollars. So that was becoming a problem. And Nixon really solved it. In 1971, President Richard Nixon abolished the gold standard. And that was a huge shockwave. It's really an important event in the history of the American empire. And what this meant was that the US could now print money more or less without limit, without having to worry about the amount of dollars convertible in gold. The dollar was not tied anymore to like a metal. And furthermore, the US demanded that all the countries who had accumulated a lot of dollars use these dollars to buy US treasuries.
Of course, coming off the gold standard, that was a huge deal. How is it that the US was able to just do this? Because, of course, we're talking about the American empire, right? The predominant imperialist power in the capitalist world. Yes. And so on. So, okay, yeah, it's accumulating debt, but the whole economy, Soviet bloc aside, the whole economy functioned on this actual mechanism whereby money was pegged to real value. So how is it that Nixon was just able to push this through? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, why is this something that only the dominant empire could do? What did it require? And why did it actually happen? Why was it pushed through?
It's a key question, really. Essentially, the short answer is because of the hegemonic position of the US. It was so dominant economically, but also militarily, that it was able to dictate essentially what it wanted in the world economy. And really, the abolition of the gold standard, what it meant for other countries in the US empire was really quite outrageous. It meant that the US could print how much money they wanted, not having to worry about any sort of values. We're basically buying manufactured goods with like fictitious money. And essentially also it enabled the US to export inflation by throwing its dollars all around the world. And it was quite a shock for the economies of other countries. But I think the key question is, so why did everybody went with it? Because often today, when Trump is doing all these tariffs, he's tearing all the rules, everybody is like outraged, oh my God, this is unprecedented. The president is flouting all the rules, blah, blah, blah. You have to remember that in 1971, people were saying the exact same thing about Nixon.
Exactly, yeah.
It was a total break with the Bretton Woods system, the system established after World War II. People were in outrage. People were saying we have to get rid of U.S. domination, of U.S. dollar, blah, blah, blah. A lot of similar things we're hearing today. But essentially,
if I remember correctly, I remember you speaking at some point that article similar to the stuff that we hear today, right, about the end of the dollar. There was a huge cottage industry of this literature because people thought, well, this has never happened. This is unprecedented. So maybe this is the end of the dollar, right?
Absolutely. Yes. So if you can go into the archives of the New York Times or the big publication around August, September 1971, and you'll see all the same things. European powers discussing about the need to get out of the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency. How it was outrageous. And so the question is, how come everybody went with it? Because in the end, that's what happened, right? And answering that question might help us to understand a little more what might happen today. So basically, the US changed the system in a quite fundamental manner where other countries would manufacture goods for the US. They would get dollar in exchange, which were not tied to gold anymore. They were just printed paper. And then they would ask these countries to return those dollars through US treasuries. US treasuries is like buying a piece of US debt. Essentially, other countries would finance the growing American budget deficit. So the US could borrow more and more to wage wars across the globe. And this was basically paid by other countries. That's sort of the cycle of the dollar. And so everybody was up in arm against this. However, what's important to understand is that Japan, France, Britain, who were very angry at the US move, were also part of the American system and were had a privileged position in this system. So, for example, Britain, France, Japan, their interests abroad were guaranteed by the U.S. Army. They would get a little bigger piece of the pie of the U.S. exploitation of the whole world. So they had a direct economic interest in the U.S. empire. And they figured that it was better to just swallow this, take a bit of a shot at their own economy in order to keep this privileged position. Mm-hmm. The U.S. also struck a deal with certain countries like the Saudi monarchy, for example, and the OPEC countries. They would produce a lot of oil, and they agreed to sell this oil only in U.S. dollars, the petrodollars, which means that anyone who wanted to buy oil needed a lot of dollars, which the U.S. treasuries were providing. And then the third world, it was really forced into submission. So to get dollars, these countries would need to take a loan at extortionate rates from U.S. banks. That's, they needed dollars to trade on the world scene. Mm-hmm. And when they could not pay, the IMF would force them to implement austerity, privatization, open their market to companies. And this has really choked the development of a series of countries. Countries who looked to the USSR as an alternative would face really the full might of the US with economic sanctions, blockades, regime change, and even direct invasion sometimes. Mm-hmm. So that's how the US system was able to turn its bankruptcy into a strength. And basically, everybody went along because either they had direct economic interest in the maintenance of the American empire, or they were just forced to. And in the end, all of this was possible because the US remained the uncontested military power of the capitalist world. Mm-hmm. So that's the short answer as to 1971 as to why everyone went with.
No choice. And crucially, nobody was willing to actually take a stand.
Yes.
Yeah. So, we're putting the Soviet Union to the side here. We will obviously get to it when it becomes relevant. I feel like for the purposes of just understanding the coming off the gold standard, it's maybe not necessary. But fundamentally, it was because the US was the dominant power and there was no other power willing to challenge it and also capable, like economically and militarily capable of challenging it. I think that's also key.
That's key. Just a quick word on the Soviet Union. We're not going to go into a whole development, but the Soviet Union was controlled by a bureaucracy inspired by Stalin, who was looking not to overthrow U.S. hegemony, but was seeking an accommodation with it. So yes, they might have sent arms here or there to like forces fighting the U.S., but in general, they were seeking peaceful collaboration with U.S. imperialism. Mm-hmm. That gives us a little bit of a hint to another country today, which is ruled by a communist party and who actually functions in very similar ways as the Soviet Union. Anyway, but we'll get to it in a second. China, obviously, I'm referring to. But basically, there was no one that was willing and able to really confront the U.S. Because essentially saying to Richard Nixon in 1971, no, we will not accept this. We will set up a counterpole system, meant really breaking consciously and frontally with the U.S. empire, which neither of the imperialist empire wanted to do at the time, and which the leadership of the colonial revolution, let's say, was either too weak or unwilling to do or misadvised by the Soviet Union.
Okay. So we've come to this first sort of crucial moment in the post-war period.
Yeah.
Of 71. As you've been explaining, this thing of the dollar coming off the gold standard, being decoupled from the gold standard, this is what's referred to as the, quote, exorbitant privilege, right?
Yes.
And how the US is able to use the dollar to crush the world. So let's start talking now about how this sort of altered system functions.
Yeah. So essentially, economically, the US prints the money. So most of the money that's used in world commerce is the US dollar. And it has conveniently its hand on the dollar tap. And it prints dollar, it buys manufacturing goods with it made in other countries. And these other countries, they end up with large concentration of dollars. And what do you do with it? You can convert a part of them in your own local currency. They do so, to pay their workers or whatever. But you cannot do that a lot because you're going to increase the demand in your own currency. Anyway, it's a bit technical. I'm not going to get into it, but they cannot convert all their dollars into their own local currency. Therefore, the easiest and most advantageous way is to buy US treasuries, essentially lending back the dollars to the US. Or else they invest the money in the stock market, which is concentrated in Wall Street in the US. Or else they buy assets in the US. So you have this situation where the US prints the money, gets manufacturing goods for it, and then the money comes back to the US. And it's this system which is quite unique in the history of empires. The US can basically borrow to levels impossible for any other countries, because every other country that they want to borrow, they'll borrow from another country, usually the US actually. And there's a limit as to how much you can borrow. But the US is in the position of both the debtor and creditor, actually. They're the one printing the money. And this system, which was sort of set up in 71, still exists in large parts. Essentially, it is by this system of debt that the US was able to put the Soviet Union under tremendous economic pressure until, I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but essentially the Soviet Union collapsed under this intense pressure. And what it meant in 1991, this was maybe the second huge chapter of the American empire, is what the US system was extended to the entire planet, bringing massive profits to the US, but also fueling its decline in industry. So capital could expand everywhere into new market, but there was deindustrialization, obviously, in the United States and other imperialist power. And this is where also you get a world economy which become even more organized around, countries in the global south, China in particular, with cheap labor producing goods for the US and Western markets. Another group of countries like totally in a state of destitution through financial strangulation. And then imperialist power sort of reaping these benefits with the US at the top.
Okay, so what you're laying out is basically the ability of the US to print endless money on the one hand. But what we also saw is, of course, a weakening industrial capacity. Now, there is a contradiction between these two things, and a contradiction, which it turns out, is actually really at the core of what we're seeing with the decline of US hegemony today and this conflict within the American ruling class about, well, what should the US do to stay on top? Like, printing endless money, yet actually at the base of it, you've got former heartlands of industry which are becoming deindustrialized. Your working classes are getting decimated. And what you see is actually China becoming the manufacturing hub of the world and some other countries in the global south. So explain that contradiction and why it's really at the heart of the crisis that the American ruling class is trying to confront.
Yeah. A lot of economists can describe what I've just described to you, the recycling of the dollar. Michael Hudson, for example, I think is very good in describing the mechanics of that system, even Yanis Varoufakis. So there's many people. However, I think what's often forgotten is that in the end, the power of the United States, like the power of any empire, is always linked to its economic and industrial might. And what you see is that in the history of the American empire is that constantly, starting right after World War II, the economic weight of the US declined and its industry becomes less and less competitive. Domestic production alone is no longer sufficient really to sustain the growing cost of empire. And to maintain this empire, they have to print more and more like fictitious money, trying to extort more and more value from other countries, through loans, debt repayment, cheap labor, etc. And so it's really this tension between the more the productive capacities of the US decline, the more it needs to use parasitical means to maintain its global empire. The more their industrial strength weakens, the more they must rely on other mechanism of really sheer exploitation to maintain the empire. And it's really this contradiction. That's a constant trend since the Second World War, a growing contradiction between the declining productive forces of the US economy and the burden of empire. It's constantly getting stretch and stretch and stretch at every new crisis. So if we just look through a little bit the post-Soviet period, we can see this in many ways. So for example, China, we have to talk about China, saw a massive industrial boom during the post-Soviet period. It became really the industrial powerhouse of the world. It was exporting large quantities of manufactured goods to the US and the West. However, China's unprecedented boom did not happen outside the US system, but actually from within it. They produced stuff for the US market. And in exchange, they accumulated massive reserves of dollars, which, what did they do with it? They reinvested them in US treasuries. Basically, they financed the huge deficit of the US. And by the 2000s, China was holding hundreds of billions of dollars in US debt. And this was worrying some in Washington. And so in this way, China was playing and still plays a significant role in the dollar system. And we'll see how with the 2008 crisis. However, China's industrial power and the size of its economy and its growing trade relations with other countries started to undermine really the whole basis of the US system. If you take, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's program for investment and of infrastructure project in other countries, you can see how they start really undermining the foundation where the US is supposed to be the boss and supposed to decide everything in the world economy. And so you see that the rise of China, although it happens from within the US system, starts to undermine its foundation. And this is part of that tension of because of China's industrial capacities are growing and growing, and the US industrial capacity are weakening and weakening, it starts to struggle to contain, for example, the strategic threat to US hegemony. Another element of this is the 2008 financial crisis. It really exposed the weakness of the US empire, that crisis. However, its immediate consequence was to strengthen the role of the dollar. So if you remember in 2008, a lot of banks were going to collapse. In order to avoid this, it did collapse, you're right. And many more were about to. The US really brought its exorbitant privilege to new heights. That is, it printed huge amounts of dollars to throw into the stock market. And this dynamic also happened in the US's junior partners. In Europe, in Canada, and Japan, banks were also about to collapse. So what did it do? It also extended unlimited lines of credit to banks in Europe. They called the swap lines, and they became a permanent fixture of the financial system. Why am I saying this? The financial system dominated by the US required more and more and more larger sums of fictitious money to prevent its collapse. And this really reflected as well the diminishing weight of the US. And so the US, in order to continue maintain its financial system intact, it needs to print more and more and more money. And you see how this tension between the money printing, the parasitical means, and the actual economic weight of the US, which is declining, are in complete relations to one another. And the second feature of the 2008 crisis, so it reinforced the dependence on the dollar, but also China played a huge role at that time to prop up the United States by buying a huge amount of US treasuries.
Well, I guess there's a number of questions. Let me just start unpicking some stuff. One, I mean, the assumption here is that China is not a capitalist country, and therefore there's this contradiction that it grew within the framework of the US empire, globalization, etc., but it is not a capitalist country, yet it poses a threat. Why is it that China played this role, propped up the US in this period of crisis? And second, you've made this claim a number of times now that the more the US weakened, the more the dollar strengthened. I think that's one of those economics is too complicated, my brain hurts sort of a point. Do you know what I mean? One of the reasons why I did want you to do this episode is to simplify how the world economy works, because I think that's one way that a lot of working people get fleeced, or think it's too specialist and we don't really know and it's not important. It's work of these specialists. But I mean, fundamentally, I think, again, this is why the Marxist method is really essential. It's you just need to kind of grasp the key elements, the key dynamics of something. But everything is immensely complicated in this day and age. Right? All the financial instruments and so on. So I guess, how is it that you've got a currency that's no longer pegged to any real value and you're printing it basically endlessly, yet the result is not a weakening and a loss of value, but a strengthening of the dollar and the dollar system? Because that is not a very intuitive thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there's multiple questions, but I'll answer your last one right away. The issue is the same as 1971. Who will break with the system consciously? Who will say, enough, we don't want your fictitious money anymore, and we're not going to, abide by your diktat? That's always the problem. The US remains the hegemonic power, and there are no force that are willing or able to really break with it yet. It could happen. I'm not saying it's going to stay like that forever, but that is still the problem. And the reason why the US is constantly weakening economically, but strengthening the dollar is essentially because it's how I explained, because since US production alone is not able to really sustain the empire, they have to maintain their place on top by extracting and siphoning ever growing amount of resources elsewhere in the working class in the US, obviously, but also in other countries. So, for example, the debt trap of the global South has the amount of debt, the amount of money that countries owe to the IMF has continually been growing in the last decades, to the point where today it's like has never been that large. A huge number of countries are facing bankruptcies, and you saw it also in the 2008 crisis. Is if the banking system was not getting an immediate influx of fake money, it would essentially collapse. So all these countries need, in the short term, these ruling class in these lesser countries subordinated in the American empire need in the short term US dollars all the time. And because the US control most of the trade, the whole world needs US dollars to function. And so it's sort of an addiction. It's basically like essentially a bit like a drug addict in a certain sense, how it works. You get addicted to the US dollars, and it's very hard to stop it unless you fundamentally break, sort of cold turkey with the entire US system and infrastructure.
I mean, I'm thinking, when you were saying about the debt trap, the global South, thinking there's a lot of really graphic examples. I think that one of the most recent ones is Sri Lanka, on the verge of collapse a couple of years ago. And yeah, I think you can use an analogy of an addiction, but it's one of those things where these countries, they're so crushed by the mechanism of imperialist exploitation and oppression that there's no choice. So that if you don't pay back your debt, if you don't have funds to
service
buy
the debt
goods
right away.
Service the debt, goods in the world economy, especially an island country like Sri Lanka, what it really poses is life and death questions for ordinary people, right? So in Sri Lanka, they started running out of medicine, out of basic goods. So this has really graphic implications on the ground when it comes down to it. So, you say addiction, but I think they also don't have a choice. I'm saying this in the current framework, right? There is a choice. The working classes can stand up, rise up, and fight back. But that's a whole other political question. But it's this question of being so under the boot, this kind of sucking the lifeblood out of these countries.
There are many measures that can be taken, cancellation of the debt, the nationalizations of certain industries against imperialist interests, or, all these are partial, certainly without a broader extension of such a movement. But the national bourgeoisies of these countries are also often completely tied or subservient to U.S. interests. They don't want to do this, essentially.
Yeah.
There's also, you mentioned graphic example. One thing that the U.S. has managed to maintain in terms of industrial production is agriculture. And there's a number of countries in the global South, in East Asia, like Mexico, who are a major importer of U.S. food. And the U.S. did that consciously to be able to starve countries who would defy its dictate. And so, so if we take a step back, you have the system where the basic dynamic of it is the more the economic power declines, the more it needs to strengthen its grip and tighten the screws on other countries. And so we saw this during the 2008 crisis. So the price, for example, of Europe, central banks getting unlimited lines of credit was a lot of austerity, massive austerity. Remember the 2010s. In the global South, the collapse of their economies was prevented with new IMF loans, which were totally destructive. And when you arrive, what's happening, then if we fast forward at the pandemic, is that this same process is elevated to an even higher level. As the economy stalled, the US printed even more money, more than like the entire spending during World War II, adjusted to those dollars. And the Allies did the same. They used even more the swap lines to throw money into the stock market to prevent its collapse, essentially. And this really stretched this US system that we've talked about of like ever-growing borrowing, printing money, to really its extreme limit. And we've seen it, for example, with inflation, which really picked up for the first time in a long time, and a massive stock market bubble. And you also see it, for example, in the US deficit, which exploded, obviously, and which today the US now spends like $1 trillion a year on interest payment alone. And, I've said that the US could borrow like in an unlimited manner earlier. They can theoretically, but it starts to become a problem when $1 trillion disappears in just interest payments for the debt. And then furthermore, you have the Ukraine war, which began in 2022. And was very significant because not only was it the first challenge to U.S. hegemony since the Cold War, but Russia was essentially cut out of the dollar system entirely. And this was really the first time since the Cold War that a significant, economy was excluded from the dollar system. But it did not crush Russia. And in fact, Russia was able to function and even win on the battlefield, against the Ukrainian army. And so all these factors, the growing debt, the printing of money, Russia challenging U.S. hegemony, and the weakening of U.S. industry, all these things sort of come together and really starts to stretch the system, the U.S. system, to existential limits and to really a breaking point. And this is when you need a new strategy for U.S. imperialism, which is really what Trump represents. He represents this wing of the ruling class, which wants to tear apart the status quo to maintain U.S. hegemony.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you brought up the example of Ukraine because of what it illustrates. You've been insisting on this contradiction between the declining economic industrial base and this fictitious money bubble that basically is what the economy is. Because that's what we understand this, as Marxists. We think this is a contradiction and this is going to burst at one point. But I think you'll often hear the strength of the economy comes from AI and blah, blah, blah. Things that are not rooted in the real economy in the real industrial process, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right? That there's these sort of new bubbles that happen and people begin to see that as a source of the continued resilience, or this shows why the American empire is not in decline, and so many other things. Right. So I'm glad you brought out the Ukraine example because it actually helps to make sense of a lot of this. I mean, of course, it's crucial in many other respects, but, just for example, looking at basic things like the amount of artillery the US is able to produce compared to Russia. Right. That's when the rubber hits the road. That's when you start to see what the different factions in the American ruling class are thinking. Hey, ultimately, we need to be able to, go to war against this competitor called China. So we can't have ourselves in a situation where we're not going to be able to arm ourselves even more in a really rapid fashion. I think that's also links to the point you've been insisting on regarding the whole question of empire, right? Ultimately, an empire is feared, respected, whatever, to the extent that it can actually enforce its power, right? And
exactly.
that requires sheer physical military force.
Yeah. And the empire continues as long as the victims and partners continue in it. I'm really glad you brought the question of the military because I think that's key. There was this idea, we've discussed it in our episode on gradualism, this idea in the post-Soviet period that you didn't need force anymore. The system could just sustain itself with investment and blah, blah, blah. And even in the US ruling circle, there was this idea that, we can move all our factories in China. It doesn't matter. We'll make a lot more money, actually. But then, you get into a reality where Russia is producing 3 times the amount of artillery shells than the entire West combined in a year. Yeah. That is a problem when you're running a global empire. China now has more surfaced vessels in its navy than the US and is producing hundreds of ships every year while the US produces only a handful. That's a problem. Yeah. And the Trump administration is actually quite conscious of that problem and want to mark a break with it. If our listener want to listen to any speech by G.D. Vance, the vice president, he always talks about this, about how the issue of the U.S. is that they don't produce anything and it's starting to threaten U.S. military supremacy. Obviously, the U.S. remains the biggest army. We're not saying it isn't, but it's starting to become a problem. Because at the end, your empire, as you said, I think quite well, your empire is maintained by force.
Okay, so you did also touch on the fact that the pandemic brought this contradiction to new levels, right? The amount of money printing that happened during the pandemic. Just as an aside, I thought it was an interesting fact in the process of working on this article. You showed us a graphic that showed how basically the hierarchy of countries, if you're sort of the junior partners of US imperialism, you get endless swap lines. So you can get endless amounts of money, endless amounts of dollars rather. But basically the lower you are on this ranking, the more difficult it is for you to get dollars, which I thought was a really graphic illustration of I don't know, just how the world works. Anyways.
Yes.
let me bring this back to the purpose of our discussion. We want to talk about how the US system works to understand why we're in a period of crisis today, why it's so turbulent, and ultimately to help us to understand what to do about it. So having this understanding is crucial also because it helps us to actually understand what is likely to happen. Right? It helps us to project future outcomes in order to understand our tasks, obviously, but also to warn, the working class about what's on the horizon and what to do about it. So I think if we can start transitioning a little bit to how this understanding of the US system that you've laid out, what bearing does it have on what's coming?
Yeah.
Like any day of the week, you open up the news, it's just crazy headlines everywhere.
Yeah.
And it can be very disorienting, very demoralizing. So how do we make sense of what the likely direction of travel is, and what can we how can we prepare ourselves?
It can help us to project and predict. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but the task of Marxists, if we want to guide the working class, we must be able to try and foresee what might happen. Mm-hmm. In the news often, so what is Trump doing? He's really seeking to reassert U.S. hegemony, to shore up its economic and political position on the world stage through various means. He's tearing up the status quo, finishing with the old liberal order of the last 30 years, and trying to reassert U.S. hegemony through sheer domination, essentially, and force. And a lot of stuff is being written about the economy, which is very disorienting. Many people are like, oh, it's the end of the dollar system. It's the end of U.S. hegemony. It's the end of the West. And it's, or else other things, they'll say, oh, whatever Trump is doing, nothing is working. This is not serious, blah, blah, blah. So we need to make sense a little bit of this. And our first starting point is that for us, it is almost sure that there will be a new economic crisis on a global scale. We cannot know exactly the depth of it, but we can be almost sure of it because a lot of the economy right now is a massive financial bubble sustained by AI, but also other things, the housing market. Essentially, since 2008, the result of just pumping massive amounts of money into the system has been to inflate a huge bubble. Our listener can just go look at the Buffett indicator, which is an indicator created by Warren Buffett, which essentially measures how much the stock market is overvalued. So at 100%, the stock market is fair valued. That is what is being produced in the real economy versus the value of the stock market correspond. Right now, it's like at 208%, which is significantly overvalued. That is the value of the actual economy versus the stock market. It's totally two parallel worlds. And at one point or another, bubbles burst and this comes crashing. We cannot know exactly how and when, but it's almost a certainty that this will happen. So knowing this, we cannot exactly know how it will unfold, but there's essentially two broad scenarios that people are often discussing. Either a crisis will shatter the entire post-war order that we've been describing in detail, really ending the dominance of the dollar. Everybody sorts of trades in their own currency, and there's sort of U.S. hegemony gets crumbled through a huge shock. Or else a majority of countries will once again accept to give a pound of flesh to save the US system once again and continue on an even more oppressive basis, just like they did in 1971, just like they did in 2008. And our belief, which is a bit controversial on the left, is that the latter is more likely than the former, i.e. that in the short term at least, an economic crisis will benefit Trump, actually. So why can we say that? Well, it's just looking at what we've been discussing for the last 40 minutes or so. What we saw in 2008, it was a financial meltdown, and it did not push countries to opt out of the dollar. On the contrary, when there's an economic crisis, all the dollars go back to the US because it's like the safe haven, and it starves the rest of the world of US dollars. So they need more dollars. And who prints the dollars? The US ruling class, obviously. And also the fact that Trump has added a bunch of tariffs on a ton of countries, he has just gained even more leverage. And so that's why we think that an economic crisis will not undermine Trump, but will actually strengthen its hand against everyone else, So people will want dollar, and it will come with conditions. In particular, in the global south, what happens in a crisis is that investment is sucked out. And there's also small little bubbles that, for example, the stock market in India, a crisis will destroy all of this. And all these countries in the global south will be immediately starved of dollar, and they will turn to the IMF to get it with debt restructuring program, which will prove to be really devastating, essentially. And so, anyway, we can describe the consequences of this crisis. But for us, our projection is that a crisis will strengthen the hand of the U.S. imperialists in its initial stage. Now, obviously, a big element out of this, which the U.S. ruling class is certainly not looking to, is actual resistance in the world against them tightening the screws. Some of our projection is that in the global south, particularly, the reinforcement of oppression by the U.S. in an economic crisis will most likely provoke important social explosions. And, because in these countries, the immediate impulse of the masses will most likely be to resist the pillage of their countries by U.S. imperialism. That's an important element to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that's quite key, just to drive home the point about the reason for us discussing, quote, economic questions is to understand what the implications of this are on the ground, and also to then be able to orient ourselves politically in terms of our tasks. So following Trump's Liberation Day, the 90-day period that's ended, and since the past few days, Trump's been on sort of this rampage again, announcing this, that, and the other amount of tariff against the different countries, right? One such country is Brazil, where it's actually slightly different. It's not just the sheer economic blackmail, but he's doing it because he's trying to stand up for Bolsonaro, right? But he threatened Brazil with 50% tariffs. And following this, there were sizable protests, I think, in some cities of Brazil. And some of the placards that people were carrying were about sovereignty, that this is an attack on our sovereignty. This is the dominant imperialist power messing around with our politics, our internal politics, through choking us, the threat of choking us, right? And I think this is what a lot of leftists fail to understand or appreciate or actually consciously ignore, because this is how it plays out in these countries, that the economic question is really inseparable from the national question, from the keenly felt oppression, the national oppression by the West. And that's why the struggle takes on this character where you have to really be able to speak to both sides of it.
Maybe you can describe a bit what the most of the left sees in these sort of two trends.
Sure. I mean, I love to go on a rant on this. I'm planning a episode in the next couple of weeks on this question. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to understand this in a little bit of the broader landscape of the left and what the historic problems are in the left, especially in the West, but not just. We identified two trends, basically. That one, you either ignore this, you ignore that there is a real felt national oppression in countries of the global south, and you therefore, just talk about, class against class, exploitation only, capitalism fight capitalism, or you totally just end up backing whatever forces on the ground in oppressed countries are fighting under the guise of fighting imperialism. So you are either totally cheering on anti-imperialist forces uncritically, whatever they are, that's radical bourgeois nationalists or whatever. Or you're saying, oh no, class against class. And, this might sound abstract, but it played out really, really concretely on the whole question of Iran, which has just happened, where a lot of the left refused to defend Iran when it was being bombed by the US. Why? Because Iran is also a reactionary capitalist regime. And I mean, if that's not bankrupt, I don't know what is. I think if we're not seeing how the economic pillage of these countries is so linked up with how the masses in those countries feel that's also an attack on their countries, on their land, then communists are never going to be able to actually make headways into these countries. I mean, there's a reason why, the left doesn't exercise a strong independent presence in many countries of the global south, right? Anyways, that rant aside, we can come back to it again, but it's just to illustrate, that from this analysis flow political priorities, orientations, and tasks. And one of those things, I think I'm going to preempt you, but one of those things you're saying is that, well, given what the US ruling class is doing currently, it really means that many countries of the global south are not going to have a choice. Those masses are not going to have a choice because they will be up against the wall. Right? When you are faced with going bankrupt as a country, you don't have a choice but to struggle. Yeah. So as communists, we have to be there to provide a perspective of struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if a ton of communists think that defending the nation against the US is bourgeois nationalist and blah, 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 well, you're not going to get anywhere. Particularly if we can predict that US hegemony reasserting its rule will lead to growing movement pushing back against this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's one.
Yeah. So that's one. Another of our projection which is a bit controversial as well, is what will happen or likely happen in the West, like in Europe or the US. An economic crisis usually accelerates current dynamics. It's an accelerator of things. It develops new dynamics at a certain point, but it's in short stage. It accelerates what we see. And what we see in the Western world is the working class is in a very dire position. The right wing is growing. This is really the political force that has the upper hand. And an economic crisis, a contraction of the economy, a growth in unemployment, we believe will actually increase the influence, most likely, of the right or far right, whatever you want to call them, and will probably have a negative impact, at least initially, on working class struggle.
Why will this increase the influence of the right? I mean, in terms of being an accelerant of dynamics, I understand that it's one thing for workers to go on strike when they feel that they can afford it. I can understand that it's difficult for workers to come out on strike when there's a high degree of unemployment, for example, because they don't want to lose their job by sticking their necks out. Right. I can understand how it might lead to less struggle. And, the history of the workers' movement shows that. But why would it lead to a strengthening of the right-wing forces? And I ask this because, again, a lot of the left tendencies out there, they think that there's almost this sort of objectivist understanding that the worse it gets, the more people hate the system, and therefore the more radical they become, and therefore the growth of socialist forces. Right? That's how it usually is understood. But you're making this claim that actually a crisis would lead to strength of the right. Why is that?
Well, what you're saying about crisis, leading to radicalization is true in general. And I'm not saying that the crisis could not years into it provoke this. But in its immediate aspect, we have to look at the current relationship of class forces. And what we're seeing in Europe is that the left is completely discredited in general, in the US as well, is completely tied to the liberal wing of the ruling class and the middle class. This layer, particularly the middle class, will be extremely squeezed by a crisis and will not necessarily go to the left to look for its interest. You have also an element of, as you mentioned, unemployment. Massive unemployment doesn't favor struggles. When there's a ton of people that are ready to take your job for half the salary, it's not usually very good conditions to fight. People look for themselves and their own self-preservation, unfortunately. And also think of immigration, for example. When there's economic, the rise of the right is often tied to anti-immigrant poison, which an economic crisis will, as it always does, fuel. And also we have to look a little bit at the experience of the last decade, where the left really failed to build a pole capable of channeling working class anger in a left-wing direction. It's really the right that has captured this. So that doesn't mean that it's going to stay this way for a decade. Certainly not. Crisis and impoverishment will provoke and also the rise of the right will provoke a shift to the left. However, what we can expect is not this in the immediate face of an economic crisis. And so why is this important? It's not like we're gloom and doom or pessimist, but it must inform how revolutionaries view their roles right now and what we can expect in the near future and what's going to be our task. Our tasks are going to be much more defensive, much more seeking to put the class in a better defensive footing, and try to keep what we have, brace for impact, really, and try to get through this very difficult period by minimizing really the damage that will come from attacks, which are already starting, by the way. So I think this is quite contrary to what many leftists were saying. Oh yeah, there's going to be a ton of class struggle in Europe. For example, the Trotskyist faction internationally predicts that Europe will be the center of major class battle in the coming period. And I think this is totally deluded and not understanding the relationship of class forces at the moment, which an economic crisis will only exacerbate against the working class. Right?
And what about China? Do you think that it will play the same role or a similar role as it did in 2008 by bailing out the US, essentially?
I think that's one of the biggest question of the world situation, obviously. So, as we said back in 2008, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party effectively really propped up the dollar system by buying massive amount of US treasuries. And right now, one of Trump's major aspect of his policy is to isolate and confront China. He's pretty open about it, that the goal of the US to shore up their hegemony, they must asphyxiate the Chinese economy. And so when there is an economic crisis, it could seem completely impossible for China to come to the rescue of the US dollar system, particularly at a time when the US is openly squeezing them, and also at a time where China has even more room to maneuver, let's say, than in 2008, actually. They have the whole Belt and Road, they have BRICS countries, etc. But you have to understand and view the Chinese Communist Party in a Marxist way. What is its class character? And the Chinese Communist Party is really a bureaucracy caught between the giant Chinese working class and US imperialism, and which is essentially a conservative force. They're interested only in their own stability and the privileges they get from, what's the leftover of the planned economy. They're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And if you understand the leadership of China in this way, you will see that they will likely want to save the dollar system in times of crisis. They will want to avoid the instability of a break with the US system. Or if they are forced to break with the US system, it'll be not from their own making. Right now, as we see, Trump is trying to essentially decouple with China, and the response of China is basically to the Chinese Communist Party is to try to reverse the wheel of time and go back to like the good old days of globalization. We cannot know exactly how this will proceed and if the Chinese Communist Party will be forced into a more confrontational stance like they've been doing lately. However, one should never really forget how a Stalinist bureaucracy works and how it always seeks accommodation with world imperialism. And when I say Stalinist, I know they're not formally Stalinist in China, Maoist, but it's this same type of bureaucracy, a sort of privileged layer on top of the economy, functions with similar dynamics as what we saw in the Soviet Union.
I mean, speaking of China, one thing we haven't been able to touch on in our discussion on the dollar is de-dollarization. Now, Of course, China is one place where all the proponents of de-dollarization, individuals, groups, forces, academics, whatever, who think that you can gradually build trading blocks that trade in alternative currencies and therefore challenge the power of the US and de-dollarize the world economy. There is, I think, the Geopolitical Economy Report people, Ben Norton, he is crazy about this. You'll read the news from the bourgeois press and it will say one thing, and then in the evening there'll be a YouTube video by Ben Norton saying Trump is so afraid of BRICS, he cannot stop de-dollarization. It's bizarre. But I was wondering if you could give us your take on de-dollarization and how to make sense of it.
Well, obviously we are in favor of de-dollarization. We are against the domination of the world by the US and therefore the US dollar as well, which strangles a ton of country. However, there's so much illusion in this. Here's the thing. Remember what we talked about in 1971? Get out of the US system. You need to break with it. And you need a political willingness to set up an alternative system. In the case of the Chinese Communist Party, they have taken measures to reduce their dependence on the US dollar. That's true. And they have taken step in that direction. But overall, they still believe in the model of the last 30 years, which enabled their growth, which is a model totally aligned and firmly within the US empire. They do not want this decoupling, this break with the US system. They're sort of being, pushed out of it, kicking and screaming. That's what's happening. But they do not have the willingness to do this. And overall, more broadly in the BRICS, the problem of the BRICS is it's a totally incoherent alliance with countries who have totally contradictory interests. So you have China, which is ruled by a communist party. Then you have India, which under Modi is super pro-US. And then you have Brazil. The US is currently squeezing Brazil. There hasn't been any strong response on the part of Lula, which, by the way, seems to be in the end of his regime. And potentially we'll see Bolsonaro come back to power, which is obviously super pro-US. And then you have South Africa, which is sort of also completely stuck and squeezed by the United States at the moment. Now there's Russia, which, as I said, has been cut out of the US system. Now they have been able to function, and they are the less dependent on the US system. They barely trade anymore in US dollar or in the system. But again, Russia its economy is really tiny compared to even the European powers, not even in the same league of China or the US. And it's largely a export economy. It's growing, it's developing itself, but it's not at all at the level of seeking to establish a competing world system than that of the US, actually. So there's a lot of buzz about de-dollarization. However, in the end, for de-dollarization to really happen and be really a progressive path, it needs to be in a really anti-imperialist confrontation against the United States. And what's really frustrating with China is that China has the means to actually undermine and counter the US system. For example, by setting up a world currency based on gold. That would be a huge step forward.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to our previous episode about gradualism, objectivism, that it's not just a block getting larger and larger, BRICS going from BRICS to BRICS plus now, or however many countries there are, but it's it's a question of politics, the political leadership, political program, whatever you want to call it. Where is the willingness to take not just a stand, because of course you can have forces that take a stand against imperialism, but actually have a strategy to fight and defeat imperialism.
Exactly.
Right. I think that's key, and that the CPC, it's not happening. That's not to say we don't have tactics and other, perspectives towards the CPC and the Chinese working class, but it's ultimately
that we do not defend them against the US as well.
Yeah,
we
yeah,
do defend
absolutely.
them.
Yeah. But I think ultimately, and I think this is why it was relevant to begin from the post-war period in terms of talking about the American empire, it is that it has been the dominant empire first, in the capitalist world and then the planet, because it has not had a force willing to defeat it, or with the capability, political perspective to defeat it. Yeah.
And that gets to our central difference with the BRICS people. We both want an end to the hegemony of the United States. However, we understand that the class nature of the various regimes of the BRICS, the Chinese bureaucracy in China, Russian oligarchs, et cetera, that they cannot really challenge in a progressive manner the U.S. system. They cannot lead a struggle to defeat really the U.S. imperialist hegemon. And that in the end, there is no shortcut to the mobilization of the working masses in the global south, as well as in the imperialist heartland, to really go on the offensive against the empire, because the proletariat is in the end the only force that has fully the interest to defeat the system, and that has no stake in its current existence. Maybe to people are far-fetched, but that is really the theoretical conclusion of this whole thing, that how the U.S. empire, because as long as there's not a force that can really defeat the U.S. empire, it will not end by itself. It will just continue with new forms of exploitation. Empires don't just disappear, as we've seen in our episode gradualism. They need to be defeated, swept away. And the question is of our time, I believe, is will this happen? Will the U.S. drag the world in a succession of crises, wars, reaction, etc.? Will the world sort of break up in great shock with competing imperialist powers, leading to new world wars? Or will the working class be able to defeat it, which is obviously what we fight for?
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately the point, right? As you mentioned at the outset, we're doing this series, 5 or 6 episodes. We're doing this series, and this is episode 3 of the series, on a memorandum that we published in the International Communist League, and that's called U.S. Imperialism Turns the Screws. And the purpose of that memorandum is to lay out, what's happening today, actually not just descriptively, but why, and what are the dynamics behind this unraveling of the post 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What's behind this unraveling, in order to be then able to arm ourselves for what's coming, and crucially, what the task is, right? Because as you just said, right, the fundamental question as we understand it is, will US imperialism drag the world down with it, or will the working class rise as an independent factor, right? That's how we're posing the question. But other groups on the left, they'll see it as inter-imperialist period where it's US versus China or something like that, or some other question where the implication of that is, well, why don't you lay out what the implication of that is?
Well, you see how we describe the entire functioning of the financial system all around US-based institution, US dollar, and backed in the end by the might of the US military. There isn't a competing world system by the Russian Empire, Chinese empires. All these countries are being squeezed and asphyxiated by the US, and whatever measures they are taking is to shield themselves from this. And so you can see that by seeing the world as inter-imperialist rivalries between US, Russia, and China, is to actually abstain on what is the actual main line of engagement and struggle right now, which is against the US, which still dominates the world economy. And still, although its economic weight is declining, is taking even more oppressive measure to remain on top. So they're completely missing the battle of not missing the battle of our epoch, but really yielding in front of the main force of
disorganizing it, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good way also. Yeah, disorganizing it. Yeah. It's really spreading confusion. China is getting squeezed by the US. We are not neutral. in this confrontation. I think that's important to underline. Yeah. So it has really reactionary implication. And I think studying how the US system works makes it even clearer, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, I think I've run out of questions in terms of how the US system works. I'm sure there's lots. I mean, this is an immensely complex,
of course,
immensely complex topic. But I think in terms of, my aim was to give a general enough understanding to be able to equip workers, supporters, leftists to be able to deal with this, to make sense of the crazy stuff that's going on today. And I think you've done that. We have got at least 2 more episodes coming up. We are going to discuss Europe and America because that's been a topic that's relevant ever since Trump has been shaking up the relationship with Europe. And crucially, the other one, Ukraine war, right? You've mentioned it. It is incredibly significant in terms of the way things will go.
We haven't made an episode on it yet, and it's so important.
No. Yeah. And Trump has been asking Zelensky how deep can he hit Russia, and he's saying, well, if we give you the long-range weapons, you can go deeper. Trump's obviously not been able to get his way so far with Putin, and this, I think, is a sign of desperation on his part. But, I think this, again, these are sort of different pieces of the puzzle to be able to make sense of a whole in terms of how the sort of liberal world order is being shredded and a new one coming into being. That, and I've got an episode planned solely on China, like what's the Chinese bureaucracy doing in this period. Anyway, so we've got 3 more to go, and those will be coming in the next, few weeks. But for today, I think that's it. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, subscribe and share the show as well. If you've liked what you've heard, it really helps us get our views increased. And,
ultimately, discussions and debates. I think in this period where that is more necessary than, I would say, other periods, the left continues, not the whole left, maybe 90% of the left continues with its head buried in the sand, doing its own thing, like, that there's not much of a need to discuss, hello, shit has hit the fan, let's debate some key fundamental programmatic questions. But there are some groups doing that.
That's why we do these things. It's like we don't think we have all the answers. We don't think we're not making zero mistakes. We probably are. However, we do present an analysis. We believe that overall it is correct. So prove us wrong or expand it if you've liked it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, on that note, thank you for your time today. We'll hear from you soon, I hope.
Surely. Thank you.
Okay. Alrighty.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.